Okay, gonna record a video here talking about the Gears of Dreadlands Demon Hunter set and the solo pushing setups that will most likely be used over the course of the season, and just the optimal ways to kind of set up your gear and which items you're looking for and things like that, because I've seen a fair amount of confusion because there's multiple setups that are not only viable but all pretty close to each other, and so just wanted to clarify that. So here's probably the least popular pushing setup, but it might end up being the best. I think it will end up being probably the second or third best setup that you could use. And so to understand this, you have to understand how this set works. So you use your primary skill, which in this case is going to be Hungering Arrow for pushing, and you need to attack with it 4 or 5 roughly times, and then you'll start strafing, and then you just attack with your primary skill every so often during the strafe, both to keep your hatred up and to refresh the buff, because you get the increased damage per second of momentum you have from the 2 set here. This is the 2 set. And so while you're strafing around, once every second or so, once every second or 2 seconds, somewhere in there kind of, is how often you want to be refreshing it, and that's about how that works. But then the 4 set is a little bit strange and different. So the 4 set, it is while you're strafing, when your strafe projectiles, which are like these very thin line things, they look similarly to the cannons on like Vengeance, for example. They're a very thin line. When those hit an enemy is what triggers the primary to shoot from the 4 set effect of your strafe. And this effect has a 9-frame internal cooldown. And so what that means is, if, for example, you are at this strafe breakpoint where you are attacking every 8 frames with the strafe projectile, travel time does come into play with this, for example, but here I'm using a bow, obviously, and I'm at this 8 frames breakpoint, not the rocket damage. Here I can actually just swap this over so that we only get the relevant breakpoint here. What this means is I'll attack once, and then 8 frames later I will attack a second time, but that second attack will not proc a Hungering Arrow. So then I need to wait until the 16th frame, and that will fire the second Hungering Arrow. So essentially every 16 frames, I'm getting a Hungering Arrow effect out of this. And so you do 60 divided by 16, and so you're getting 3.75 Hungering Arrows per second, is the way to think about that. And then obviously you're interspersing this once every second or two with a manually casted Hungering Arrow, and the attack speed on this is modified by Hunter's Wrath and stuff. But you can see then while you're doing that, you're also going to be getting a little bit lower than this number based on how often you are needing to use the manually casted Hungering Arrow. So you have the amount of time that casting that takes, but also you will have to manually cast more often if your attack speed is higher, because the hatred per second cost of strafe is higher the higher attack speed you have. So because I'm at this 1.71 attack speed here, you're essentially multiplying the cost by the amount of attack speed you have, and so this cost will be lower than if your attack speed is higher. So what would actually be more optimal for me to do, let me go in here and see which ones I have enabled, is if I disable the Enchantress Aura. Now you see I go down to 1.66, and that drops us to the 9-frame breakpoint. So this would be ideal for a bow setup, is that you will want to stay at this attack speed breakpoint for the 9 frames per attack, and now you can see the hatred cost is lower. Your Hungering Arrow breakpoint is about the same number of frames, but you'll need to be, first of all, you'll be getting a Hungering Arrow every 9 frames, so you do 60 divided by 9, and you're getting 6 2/3 Hungering Arrows per second. So if we divide this by 3.75, you can see this is just dropping attack speed, right? All we did was lose 3% attack speed, but I've effectively increased our DPS by 78% by doing this. So that's why these breakpoints matter a lot. Not only have I increased, and probably more than 78%, because I've also reduced the hatred cost and how much I'll need to be manually casting Hungering Arrow. So knowing these breakpoints is extremely, extremely, extremely important, and people did not know this on PTR, and that's why you're seeing some different other things coming into play here that are confusing people. So that's basically how the breakpoints work for Strafe, and that's why you want to be at these very specific breakpoints. So the bow setup uses Odyssey's End, and what you're doing is not only are you just casting Hungering Arrow and then going back to Strafe, and you're always just cycling between these two abilities as far as damage goes, but you're also cycling in Entangling Shots. And so these are increasing the damage that enemies will take by 150%. That is an additive 150%. So for example, the Taeguk gem, instead of Bane of the Trapped, will give you higher damage against enemies, but it's additive damage. So it's also additive with the Entangling Shot debuff. So because they are additive together, it's actually better to use Bane of the Trapped in this setup instead of Taeguk. But that also means you're going to be squishier. Because you're not going to have the armor from the Taeguk effect. But then what you're doing is you essentially have these kind of like 4 or 5 skills. I would change this to Gloom probably, but this could also be a smokescreen. It's kind of a preference there. But these 2 skills, then Vengeance, and then something plus Preparation is probably going to be your 5 of the 6 skills, and then the 6th skill is going to generally either be Wolf Companion or Entangling Shot on basically all of these setups. You can technically go Fan of Knives, Bladed Armor, but as you push higher in the season, the way Greater Rift scaling works is that you're going to be getting more and more Paragon levels, and you can put more and more of them into Dexterity, and at a certain point, the monster health from each Greater Rift level increases by like I forget what it is. I want to say it's like 8% multiplicatively or something. I forget what it is off the top of my head. But the damage that the monsters deal is only like a 2 or a 3% increase. So basically, the time to kill monsters increases much quicker exponentially than the damage that the monsters deal to you. So the higher you go in Greater Rift level, basically, comparatively, the less damage the enemies will be dealing to you. And so as you get higher and higher in damage and pushing and things like that, because the damage increase is so small, and because eventually the Paragon levels, even if you're just putting it into Dexterity, you're going to be getting so much armor that your toughness will be increasing at the same time. Eventually your toughness increase from Paragons kind of outweighs the damage increase that the monsters will be dealing to you, and so you can eventually drop a little bit of defense in favor of more offense, and that will allow you to push like 150s and stuff. You might also see at the very highest pushes is that you will see people not using Bane of the Stricken because of the seasonal effect, and so then this might swap over to using Taeguk, or maybe something else. I don't know what it would be really. Probably Zaze, if not Taeguk, but I'm pretty sure Taeguk would be better here, even if it's additive with the Entangling Shot. But that is one reason and one factor why the Entangling Shot Odyssey's End setup here is probably not going to end up being the best. The other factor is that during your Greater Rifts, you're going to be getting Pylons, and the important one to pay attention here for the attack speed breakpoints is obviously the Speed Pylon. And so you can see I'm barely under this 9 frames breakpoint here. I even have taken 4 points in the attack speed on Paragons, and I have a 18% quiver. That is, I believe, the maximum you can have. I think you can technically also go to 19, and it still shows the 9 frames here, but this does show as 1.67. But if you go too much more than that, this goes down to the 8 frames. So you can have a 19% quiver with 0 points in Paragon, or an 18% quiver and have 4 points in the attack speed in Paragon to hit this breakpoint with a no attack speed weapon Odyssey's End, and I have no other attack speed aside from the quiver and the Paragon there for attack speed increase for a bow. But what happens is when you have the Speed Pylon, now what would be optimal is we're in that weird situation again, where now I'm only going to be getting a Hungering Arrow on the first frame and then not at 7, but then I have to wait all the way until 14 frames have passed. And so what would be ideal is if you could hit the 6th frame breakpoint here while staying at the 9 frame breakpoint without the Pylon. But you can see basically if I add any more Paragon, I'm going to hit the 8 frame breakpoint, and I'm going to lose so much damage by lowering myself by hitting the higher breakpoint that I can't actually hit that with the Speed Pylon. So the Speed Pylon here is actually basically useless for us. It increases our movement speed a little bit. It technically increases the rate that Stricken will stack, and a couple other things. But the point is that in this setup, the Speed Pylon is not very useful. The Bane of the Stricken might be not as useful, and now you have Taeguk, and those 2 gems are additive. And you're also essentially going to be getting less Hungering Arrows over the course of the Rift because you're having to use Entangling Shot. And so what you do with Entangling Shot is you Entangling Shot once, then you strafe around for a bit. That Entangling Shot can spread to all the enemies that you're trying to hit. The Hungering Arrow setup here definitely wants a lot of mob density. That's how the pierces work for increasing the damage. So the way that Hungering Arrow works, just to talk about this now, is that each arrow, once it spawns, has a set distance, maximum distance, that it will travel before it disappears. I don't know what it is. It's something like, let's say, 80 yards of distance. And what it will do is when it pierces an enemy, it will pierce them, and then it goes about, I would say, 5 yards, or maybe 5 to 10 yards past the enemy, and then it will turn around and go back towards them. So it can change direction, like the projectile changes direction or whatever. I should have gotten a video of this. I can maybe upload that as a separate video and link it later as a clip just to demonstrate what I'm talking about. But then, you lose like the 5 to 10 yards of distance or whatever before it turns around and comes back to the enemy. So it can only pierce the same enemy doing that, let's say 8 times, if it's a 10-yard thing in total, 5 yards out, 5 yards back in. And it has an 80-yard max range. If I spawn the Hungering Arrow and I'm strafing right on top of him, it will pierce him 8 times and then disappear. So the maximum damage increase per pierce you could get here would be 8, this number like 8 times on top of the baseline damage that you do with Hungering Arrow. And so with Entangling Shot, if I'm getting less of them over the course of the Rift, because I'm strafing around with Entangling Shot, that'll spread, and then I'm Hungering Arrow. That's why I want the, so I completely missed the point here and forgot what I was fully saying. Why density is good is because instead of having to go out the 5 yards and then back in 5 yards and losing that 10 yard of distance every time it pierces, I can essentially go from mob 1 to mob 2 to mob 3 to mob 4, and if they're all right on top of each other, I basically only spend maybe like 2 yards in between each of those pierces, and so I get much more pierces stacking up more quickly and for less distance at the same time. So you're able to get much higher pierce damage and much higher damage out of Hungering Arrow, and you're also hitting more targets and getting area damage when they're all clumped together at the same time, and things like that. And so that's why in these setups you have S of Johan here to clump the mobs. You can put this on your follower though, and so I think what we'll see is we'll actually see Flavor of Time in these builds in the highest pushes that are using Odyssey's End, and that's pretty much one way to go about it. So why are you seeing Valla's Bequest to come into this picture? And the reason is because of these strafe breakpoints that people didn't understand. So what Valla's Bequest does is that strafe projectile that you're firing, it will hit the first enemy and it procs the Hungering Arrow, but you can see then this strafe frames per attack here, it's on Rocket Storm again. Just to clarify this, it's on the 7 frame breakpoint here. So then you're waiting for 14 frames again, so it's the same as the bow. But what you can do is either drop a area damage here, and I'll show this later, but you would actually end up dropping the dexterity and having that in addition to the area damage, is that you can get up to this 2.14 breakpoint and get it down to 6 frames, so then you're hitting and spawning a Hungering Arrow every 12 frames. And so what the Valla's Bequest is doing, if I just remove this back, is that instead of the Hungering Arrow only spawning after 14 frames, when not the second, because that one is a dud, but the third strafe projectile fires, because you have the one fired on like frame 0, one fired on frame 7 that doesn't proc it, and then one fired on frame 14. Instead of having to wait for the frame 14, what Valla's Bequest does is that first, or that second, most likely, strafe projectile, it will pierce the first enemy after 7 frames or whatever, for example, but then it might pierce a second or third enemy at frame 8 or frame 9, and then the one that, when it pierces that third enemy on frame 9, it will spawn the Hungering Arrow projectile. So the way Valla's Bequest is working is it's getting a damage increase because the strafe projectile's pierce legendary effect is proccing the 4-piece internal cooldown more reliably on the 9th frame for these hand crossbow breakpoints that don't line up as cleanly as the bow does. But as we saw, if I swap this to attack speed, I can get this breakpoint down to 6 frames. So then you're hitting it every 12 frames. So the higher breakpoint you can get with the hand crossbow, the less benefit Valla's Bequest is giving you. Valla's Bequest also if I load it up here, you can see it spawns with strafe damage by 75 to 100%. You can roll that off because that doesn't do anything for you. And so Valla's Bequest essentially gets another free primary. So you can see we have the damage increase, the dex, the area damage, and cooldown reduction. And obviously the socket from a Ramaladi's gift. So you're also getting one more primary on your weapon, but that realistically doesn't matter too much. It's basically 1,000 dexterity, which when you're getting up super high Paragon is not that big of a damage increase. It's around maybe like 2 to 5% damage increase or something. It's fairly minor in terms of the primary being a damage increase. The main benefit is that it's proccing this breakpoint internal cooldown more reliably. So if you do, I think I want to do 12 divided by 9. Yes, you're getting about a 33% damage increase if you're proccing it every 9 frames instead of every 12 frames, for example. So that is the benefit that Valla's Bequest is giving you. And here he has S of Johan again, or Johan, but this would possibly be swapped for a Flavor of Time. And you can see here the DPS is a bit lower because in this setup, if you're already hitting these higher frame breakpoints, that 33% damage increase does not really compare to the Odyssey's End, which basically is giving you a 1.5 damage increase. I don't know why that's not loading now. That's weird. Let's try reloading this. There we go. And it's also on a cleaner breakpoint for the lower end, but the benefit with the hand crossbow and being at this higher breakpoint, if we go back and change this, is that if you're at a high enough breakpoint here, I believe it's 2.14, just hitting that 2.14 will do this for you. And again, let's swap this over, is that with the speed pylon, you go up to this 5 frame breakpoint. So you actually get a benefit out of the speed pylon as well with the hand crossbow setup. So this way you're getting you're getting a hungering arrow every 10 frames instead of every 9 frames, but that's a very minor increase. We can do 10 divided by 9. It should be an 11% increase, which it is. And so basically the more optimized your gear gets, the less value the Valla's Bequest is giving you, because the higher Paragon you are, the less the primary matters, and the better your gear in terms of getting these correct breakpoints set up and things like that, the less the legendary effect is giving you in terms of additional hungering arrow procs. And so that's why you're seeing the Valla's Bequest be very good early on in the season, but later on in the season this will probably be dropped off entirely. So then the other thing you can do is you can see here we have the cubed Dawn and equipped a satchel, and this gives us 15% hungering arrow damage, which is a multiplier, but we already have 30% from our other gear. It gives you 10% crit chance and a little bit more attack speed. You don't need the 20% attack speed here, just the 15% from dual wielding is fine. And then things like that. So what you can do is you can actually dual wield and equip the Dawn instead and cube the satchel, and that will increase the both of these matter, their legendary effect. 65 or 64, 63% vengeance is very important. And then the hungering arrow thing, obviously you want this to be as high as possible. So here, dual wielding gives you a 15% attack speed increase. You can see here again, we're going to be below that attack speed breakpoint. If I just get the attack speed roll on gloves here, you could also do this on a ring, but gloves should be better technically. This does not get you to that breakpoint. It's on Rocket Storm again. It's only 7 frames. So what you should do here is use the Enchantress as your follower, and that gets you the extra 3% without needing a roll on gear. The Templar is also good, but you don't really need the Hatred from him. It doesn't help that much. We're not really resource starved here. It's more just cooldowns and the breakpoints and stuff like that. The Scoundrel is also pretty good. Both Hysteria and Anatomy are good. Anatomy should be more damage than Hysteria. But because this gets you the breakpoint, this matters for the hand crossbow. I think if you're using a bow, you would probably want to go with the Scoundrel for Anatomy, but that doesn't matter too much. Anyway, so now you can see you hit this breakpoint at 2.16, and you're at this 6 frame breakpoint. And so what this gives you is now you have a bunch more crit hit damage. You have a little bit lower crit chance. That should... Oh yeah, it's because this is using S of Johan instead of a Flavor of Time. So you could you would have higher crit chance than this, so it isn't displaying quite correctly. And so this setup should be better, but it's going to be hard to get a well-rolled Ancient Dawn that has the efficacies you want. You're also needing enough cooldown to still have permanent vengeance and things like that. And so this is a setup that is good for now, early on in the season when the Valla's Bequest is benefiting you, but in theory, this setup is basically inferior to the Ballista Squirt setup. So you can see here, if I enable everything, we've got Taeguk, Banning the Stricken, no stacks, all this stuff is enabled. We don't have, and again, if you're just at this 2.16, if you get the speed pylon, that does get you over enough to hit the 5-frame breakpoint here. So that's very good. We're not including ambush in this, and so you can see the DPS per hungering arrow it's like 7 trillion or something, and the increase per pierce is like 1.8 trillion roughly on here for devouring arrow, and this is without the speed pylon. So if you go over to Ballista Squirts, this is very similar to that setup in that because the Valla's Bequest is not giving us very much benefit on the attack speed, we can swap it out for a Fortress Ballista, and then similarly to the Odyssey's End, we get Squirt's Necklace. So this doubles our damage. So we're getting a whole bunch of damage increase here by essentially using the same setup that this setup has, but instead of using S of Johann, we have the Squirt. So we're just getting a much better legendary effect, and it's doubling our damage. And we're using the Fortress Ballista to give us a shield so that we don't take damage and keep this buff up more reliably, and things like that. And so we basically get the same benefit as the dual wielder, the Valla's Bequest setup, but we basically double our damage for free. And so this becomes much closer to the Odyssey's End setup, but the benefit of this setup is, for one, you will be just tankier by the nature of having Fortress Ballista. So this basically gives you 30% more toughness as a result of this. You can start off using things like either Boar Companion, or you can still go with Smokescreen and things like that, but you can eventually drop that and go Wolf Companion, so you will end up getting not just doubling our damage from this, but also 15% multiplier on our damage from the Boar effect, and that'll be up half the time. And so you're essentially equaling the damage of the Odyssey's End setup. The bow will have a bit higher weapon damage, so it is still going to be close, but because you're able to just focus on hungering arrows and strafing, and you're not needing to fire entangling shots, I think this setup will end up being more damage. And also, this setup should be tankier as a result. What you can also do is, if you eventually get tanky enough, is you can see here I have steady aim. This would normally be numbing traps right now while pushing, because you need the toughness. You can see here the toughness is like 3.6 or whatever. I have to load this by doing this. It's kind of annoying, but it's fine. You can see here our toughness is a bit lower, and that's without the shield, I believe, from the Fortress Ballista. Don't know if I can check if that's enabled or not. It doesn't look like it. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, that toughness should be without the Fortress Ballista shield. So imagine this times 1.3. And so you'll have a bit more reliable toughness. You'll be more tanky, but you're also going to be doing similar or higher amounts of damage. Matching the crit hit damage to crit chance is pretty vital here, and so you'll have attack speed here. Eventually you can roll the dexterity off back into area damage. You can possibly go slightly below the cooldown reduction you need and just have a little bit lower uptime. On Vengeance, you'll have a half second downtime here, 0.54 seconds, and that will allow you to get an additional dex roll on your weapons, or a damage roll instead of cooldown reduction on your weapons, so that increases the damage a little bit. The issue with dual wielding is that a 10% damage roll, for example, on this weapon, because you alternate attacking with each weapon, is that this is essentially only a 5% damage roll, and you need 2 damage rolls to actually get the 10%. So this isn't really optimal until you're like super high Paragon, and the 1000 dex will be worth more to you, because it's going to be 5% damage per 1000 dex roll, and so, or the cooldown reduction, which would be what you would replace like the cooldown reduction with or something on gloves, for example. And that's going to be a 5% damage increase, so if you get 2 of them, it's a 10% damage increase. So you're getting like the same damage increase, but you're also increasing your tankiness at the same time instead of just your damage. There's a lot of complicated things going on. But anyway, once you get tanky enough and high Paragon and end of the season stuff, you might eventually drop this for steady aim. The problem is, as I mentioned earlier, the closer you are to enemies, the less distance the hungering arrow that you spawn has to travel, and so the more pierces it can do. It shouldn't matter too much, and steady aim should still be a damage increase because 10 yards is very small, and so you'll probably just want to stand slightly out of range and you can drop numbing traps for steady aim and possibly get a damage increase that way for pushing. You likely won't need that to push, and so numbing traps will probably still end up being used because the season theme is going to be so powerful that you won't need it to push 150, and just the defensive benefit is useful. And this damage defensive benefit does multiply off the 30% higher toughness that you're going to have for the Fortress Ballista Shield as well, so that matters a fair bit. You also have the Taeguk in this setup, so you're going to be having 20% increased armor compared to the Odyssey's End setup because we don't have the Odyssey's End being additive with Taeguk, so now you're also getting 20% more damage from the Taeguk Legendary Gem because it's 8% damage times 10 compared to the 60% from the Bane of the Trapped and things like that. There's a couple optimizations you can do with gear regarding toughness, so instead of vitality, going for resist all, or for example, reduce damage taken from elites on like chest piece is probably going to be better than 15% life most of the time. It depends a little bit. You can see here they're all pretty close. Both 650 vitality, 15% life, and 130 resist are all about a 10 to 12% toughness increase. But the 15% life is going to be the least useful because it will increase the shield by a proportional amount, but I think the toughness per the shield would still be better if you got resistances instead of life itself, is how that works. Per hit. I'm trying to think of how that works in my head. Anyway, but it doesn't matter too much. They're all pretty close, and your defensive rolls on gear don't matter too much. Also, once you're super high Paragon, if we go up here and look at particularly 50% crit damage compared to flat damage on a ring, it can be worth it to drop one of the 50% crit damage rolls and go for a flat damage roll on rings, and that is a slight damage increase. But it doesn't matter too much. So if I just reload this whole profile thing and go back here to the start, you can see here you get around 14.5 DPS per Hungering Arrow, and you get 4.5, I think this is billion or trillion, I forget what we said, but per pierce. And then if we go back to the Ballista Squirt setup, that's going to be higher because I have steady aim, so let's swap that out. And then all the rest of this should be the same. So here you can see we have 19 billion instead of, it doesn't want to switch, and 4.6. So it's a little bit higher DPS and per pierce. Your breakpoint does lose you a bit of that damage because you're only going to be baseline hitting every 12 frames instead of every 9, so you lose a bit of that. But like I said, you're also going to be having a bit more benefit, and you can probably you're going to be getting more benefit out of a speed pylon. And so the other thing to keep in mind here is both with Convention of Elements and the speed pylon, these are two things to keep in mind, is when you want to be using the manually casted Hungering Arrow. So for your Convention of Elements, you basically want to cast Hungering Arrow and be at max hatred going into your cold rotation, and I believe physical is before cold. And that way you can strafe for 2 seconds during cold, use Hungering Arrow once, and when you just hit 18 on the momentum timer, go back up to 20 and then strafe for the final 2 seconds of cold. And that's the most optimal way to use that. You don't want to just strafe the full 4 seconds because the momentum damage buff will drop too much. So manually casting one Hungering Arrow in between is optimal for that. Obviously, if you're using Odyssey's End, during the physical rotation is when you want to be using the entangling shots, so it's hard to use your manually casted generator during the same time, but you can do it. So that makes it a little bit more awkward. So basically, the Odyssey's End setup is less tanky. It probably scales less better at higher paragons and higher pushing tiers, and it seems much more of a clunky playstyle to play with. So I believe this setup is what's going to end up being the optimal end of season top pushing setup for this. And then obviously you also get the benefit of the speed pylon. And so the speed pylon, what this will do is you're going to have to manually cast Hungering Arrows a lot more to keep up with the hatred cost of this. You can see it's 32 per second. And so the same thing, especially you want to be manually casting the Hungering Arrows so that you have enough hatred during the cold rotation of Convention to not go out of hatred or whatever. It's very easy to not cast Hungering Arrow enough manually while you have a speed pylon. If you get speed and channeling at the same time, then that's beneficial, but you can't really rely on that. So yeah, just knowing that is how to optimally use the convention cold rotation, and especially with a speed pylon, you want to be topping up your hatred before going into the cold rotation. Okay, so that's I think most of like the optimizations and stuff as far as the pushing setup goes. Let me know if you still have any questions. Hopefully this clarified a lot of things and reasons why you're seeing Valla's Bequest. So if we go over here, this was all Voodoo Joe's profile stuff that I was using and modifying, so shoutouts to Voodoo Joe for that. He's also made some great videos and explained stuff very well. This is Rex, and I modified his here to be, you can see here we have enough toughness because we have so much more Paragon, and we've put it all into here. I don't know why he put some into Hatred, but I guess that is maybe a slight quality of life thing, but it should be unnecessary, so you could even have more in here. Anyway, you can see we have higher toughness, but we dropped numbing traps, so we have steady aim, although numbing traps wouldn't have been taken into account in that. So we've swapped over to using steady aim there, and things like that. You can see here, where can I find it? The weapon damage here is 7% still over the 50% crit hit damage, so it's kind of independent of Paragon. It's more dependent on what other crit rolls you have on gear and things like that. But this does increase our damage a very, very tiny amount. It doesn't matter too much. It's quite minor. So you can see here, if we go 37.8 and 9.2, and then switch this 37.8 and 9.2 to weapon damage, you go 37.9 and 9.3. So it's like a 1% damage increase or something. It's like pretty minor, but that's a slight optimization you can do. Your gear, here we have reduced damage from elites, and you have vitality there. Here you've got vitality. I think you want to drop one of these for a resist. Oh, it doesn't look like you do, I guess. You can drop the reduced damage from elites potentially for a life roll here, and that's about equal as well to the all resist roll. They're all pretty close. Like I said, they're all 10 or 12% roughly. It depends on what you want. I think the reduced damage taken from elites is slightly better if you're mainly taking damage from elites, but if you're taking damage from white mobs, which depending on the mob type you will be, things like that. So yeah, that's basically most of the optimization you can do. And then yeah, here you would go 10%. Here's where you could also drop the cooldown reduction once you're super high in Paragon, and that maybe half second of downtime isn't as risky for you, if you can play around it, is you'll have 10%, 24%, and 10% on a weapon. You'll have the quad Vecta gloves. You'll have 8% on shoulders there for cooldown, and those are your main cooldown pieces. And then on the other weapon, you can essentially drop the 10% cooldown roll for a 1000 dex roll, and that's a slight damage increase. Otherwise, you can swap this back to cooldown, and instead of cooldown on shoulders, you can go resist all here, or life as well, and that will be a bit more toughness for you. So you can customize things here a little bit based on what rolls you get and things like that. I think the damage won't matter too much, like I said, because of the season benefit and things like that. So that's kind of what like a super optimal end season like setup will look like. Obviously, all this gear is like perfectly optimized or whatever because it's in D3 planar. But yeah, basically the Dawn plus Fortress Ballista and Squirt's necklace setup with the Quiver cubed is most likely going to be the best soul pushing setup. You'll probably still use numbing traps. Steady aim is probably not worth it and not needed, especially with the season theme. But maybe once the season is over and we don't have as powerful of a season theme, you'll see people using steady aim on non-season or something. I don't know. But anyway, hopefully that explains most of why the set works the way it does, why you're seeing Valla's Bequest and all these other weapons. Bariza is not that useful. It has an internal cooldown and it basically does nothing for you. And it's mostly about these strafe breakpoints that you need to hit at certain attacks per second with the weapons. The attack speed on weapon is a little bit different than rolling it on gear, so you'll drop one area damage roll on either gloves or rings, but gloves is the best place for it, to get the 7% attack speed roll until you're super high Paragon, and then you can drop the 1000 dex back for a 20% area damage, and that's to hit this 2.14 breakpoint so that you're at the 6 frames, and you're getting a Hungering Arrow every 12 frames. The Odyssey's End setup is potentially easier to use. What I would recommend is basically using a bow if you're just farming like T16 rifts and stuff, or bounties, and using a Yang's recurve actually instead of an Odyssey's End, because their resource cost reduction helps you just strafe around really fast and things like that. Okay, I think that covers pretty much everything. If there's any other questions, let me know. I'll maybe record a video showing the strafe, like distance travel away from a target before it turns back thing as a separate clip, and I'll link that maybe in the description. That's all I got. Hope that helps explain things and understand why the optimal pushing setups are going to be like transitioning the way they do into what they're going to be. Yeah, cool.